Okay, good afternoon, good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and we are here with the LaRouche PAC Strategic Update for Monday, January 23rd. I'll be joined this evening by Michael Steger, and I'm going to go right to the latest developments from LaRouche PAC from our website, because we're going to take this up very in detail in terms of, I think tonight's discussion should really be the end of a dying empire, the globalist system, the end of the globalism, end of Davos, the World Economic Forum, and the question of what we're going to bring forward for the future of mankind and the future of the American Republic. And that future is really determined on the citizens of this republic, understanding what is going to be required to pull us out of this collapsing system into a system of great economic progress and into a system where we return to the ideas and principles of our constitutional republic. I think for those who didn't have a chance or may have missed a very important discussion that LaRouche PAC held on this past Saturday as a part of a class given by Bob Ingram on national sovereignty, I would encourage those who are listening on YouTube, listening online to the recording of this discussion, that everyone goes back and watches that discussion and that presentation of the concepts of national sovereignty and what that truly means in terms of the basis of our Declaration of Independence, of how our republic was actually founded. All right, so just to kind of highlight here, and Michael's going to take this up more in detail, I want to show you the latest post from our LaRouche PAC website. I'll just read them to you here. For some reason, I'm getting stuck on the computer here. But so the latest post, including by the first one here that you will see, called "Call Them Bushes, Not Rhinos," or the Uniparty, by Bruce Director, is very important. People should take a look at it. That what we're seeing right now in terms of the ongoing targeting, as President Trump announced his campaign for the presidency, his run for the presidency in 2024, the idea that the coup and the attacks on President Trump and the whole Russiagate lies and scandals have not stopped really have to be pinpointed to, as Bruce points out in his article here, on the role of the Bushes. And this goes to directly, if you didn't read it before, an article that Barbara Boyd put out on the role of DeSantis and his closeness with the Bush family operations. I just want to say on this too, that Lyndon LaRouche has, that Lyndon LaRouche was very emphatic in his understanding of the dirty operations of the Bush family, from Prescott Bush to George H.W. Bush to Bush Jr. and others. But the point is that you must read this article to get an understanding of why this apparatus is out to bring down Donald Trump, and why this has to be understood is detrimental to the existence and the progress of our nation. So we're going to be talking about that a bit more. There he was showing the example of the Bush family operations and the fact that Donald Trump took down, don't forget, Jeb Bush and put an end to the Bush dynasty in 2016, as you'll see in this article. Now, I won't go into this too much, but because Michael's going to take this up, but very important. Everyone knows that World Economic Forum, Davos just happened, on last week. And we saw that They continue to push their insane policies for the green agenda, for climate change, but more emphatically or importantly, to understand that what was represented at Davos really shows how this system is ready to come down. We're looking at the end of Davos. This article by Robert Ingram, is extremely important to understanding that the number one issue on the agenda, more so than climate change and social contracts and anything that had to do with this whole green fascist agenda, was the continued emphasis that the war in Ukraine and defeating Russia was more important than anything. Well, you'll hear about this. I can tell you that people like Colonel Douglas Macgregor are making clear that this isn't going to happen until hell freezes over. For, those are my words, not his. But the fact of the matter is the situation is devastating Ukraine, and that there has to be a peace strategy. And many people are recognizing that President Trump made clear that this endless war policy had to be put to an end, and has called for a peace strategy in Ukraine, which really must be looked at more seriously now than ever. And Michael can stress the importance of what Colonel Macgregor said about the fact that you have had more people die in Ukraine in the last 9 months than 10 years of more people killed than 10 years in Vietnam. And that really should strike everybody. So last thing on here that I'll just show really quickly is the question of the fight around, we'll take this up a little bit, the question around the fight around the House debt ceiling fight threatens Wall Street and London, not Social Security. And I think this is really important because President Trump has made clear throughout that he is demanding that Social Security not be touched. So there's a number of other articles on there that people should take a look at. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Michael so that we can lay out this picture a little bit more and really address, for those who join us in the discussion period, we'll get into some more exciting developments going on. And that's why in terms of exciting developments around economic and scientific progress, which I would encourage everybody who listens to this, who is not participating in the live discussion, to sign up with LaRouche PAC so you can participate on our website, participate in our discussion period. We'll get more into detail on this and take your questions as well. So with that, Michael, go ahead.
Great, thanks, Keisha. So I think there's two major questions that stand out in my mind. I'll raise those tonight, and then I'm interested to hear your feedback and thoughts, given the broader dynamic. So it's hard to not take into account what Keisha reported at Davos. People like Jamie Dimon, Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Union, a lot of delegates from Eastern Europe, all emphasizing that the whole world, the whole focus and attention is not on carbon dioxide emissions. You might have the bloviated Gore and the John Kerrys of this world and so on there, and Greta and all the other deranged and people. But the focus that key people that were attending directed their attention towards the situation in Ukraine. Now, we've spent some time on it. I'm not going to give an intense a detailed overview, but I might touch on a few things of where it stands. But I think one thing we can say is no one really knows how the Russians are going to proceed. But what we do know is that the Russians have the ability to win a military victory. And that victory cannot be seen simply within the confines of the borders of Ukraine. As much as the West would like to pretend, and when I say the West, I mean London, DC, Brussels, as much as these kind of bureaucratic centers, which is what they are, they're massive bureaucracies where there is no real quality of leadership, whether it's Sunak or von der Leyen or Biden. These are all collective bureaucracies. But their response, their orientation is from directions from that broader oligarchy. They'd like to believe that this is a war fought within the boundaries of Ukraine. But it certainly is not. In some sense, you very likely will see comparisons that the way that the Russians have sucked the West into Ukraine would be like how the geopoliticians of Brzezinski and others looked to suck Russia or the Soviets into Afghanistan. It is not hard to imagine, and why it was on the minds of many that attended Davos is because what is at stake is certainly not the military conflict in Ukraine, but it is the paradigm or axioms of policy of the post-Cold War neoliberal era, dominated by those three centers of massive financial and military bureaucracy. Largely financial, and the military, of course, is the dumb giant of the US military with people like Milley and lockstep. It is obviously such an obsession that even Bojo, the former prime minister and an ongoing clown of the British Parliament, Boris Johnson, showed up once again in Kiev on Sunday to receive his honorary citizenship. They have put everything, they have put all the chips on the table. And this is not something unique. This goes back, and it is the very question of the political fight in the United States towards the George Bush presidency, George H.W., or Bush 41, in the post-Cold War, fall of the Soviet Union, the entrance into the Iraq First Gulf War, entrance into the Balkans, and a promise at that time, a pledge that we would not extend NATO. If the Germans gave up and allowed Germany to reunify, that as long as the Soviets did that, we would not, be speaking to the American leadership and institutions, that we would not expand NATO eastward. And it was within, I think, Clinton's second term, then NATO expanded, I think to the Baltics and a few others, and then it quickly expanded under Bush Jr. or Bush 43. And Bush 43 even made pledges, I think in 2008, the last year of his presidency, for Georgia, which sparked a very quick war there, and to Ukraine to join NATO. But this was a Bush family legacy, and it was started at the very end of the Cold War by 1990 in the fall of the Berlin Wall. The promises were made, but like we've seen today recently with Merkel, and who was the other one? Was it Macron and Merkel, who both basically said that their intentions for negotiation, I'm not sure if Macron admitted this, certainly Merkel did, that the intentions to negotiate the Minsk agreement was always a fraud, that we never intended to actually negotiate anything with Russia. We were intending to militarize Ukraine. And that's exactly what they did. They built up an army of 500,000 troops. They built 4 kind of Maginot lines, fortified defense locations in the Donetsk, Luhansk areas of eastern Ukraine. This is what they did since 2014. And as Kamala Harris made it very clear in February of last year, at the Munich Security Conference, she again invited Ukraine to join NATO. They continue to pledge that Ukraine will join the EU. So what Ukraine represents, this conflict, is not a question of will Russia win the military conflict? It incorporates the entire agenda of regime change, which we saw in Ukraine in 2013-14, Obama, McCain, Newland, the whole agenda. But it was intending to overthrow the Saddam Hussein regime, a former ally under Bush and his CIA buddies during the Iraq-Iran conflict, but now set up as a stooge to continue to push the policies of the neocons. So this neoliberal agenda, it also coincides with the entire climate change agenda. What have we seen in just the recent period? Japan has gone back to a full nuclear energy agenda. They realize under these circumstances, we are just going to be insane. And the nature of the Japanese government is one where the people running the ministries are top-level bureaucrats. They're not political media hogs like we see in the United States or in Western Europe. So they recognize the security of Japan requires that nuclear energy. Germany has not yet made that bold step. Maybe they will. You have to imagine that the entrepreneur, engineering, industrial faction in Germany has to see an opening at this point for the bankruptcy of this neoliberal dominance of Germany. As we've said before on these calls, it's Lord Dismay. In 1945, they said the point of NATO is Russia out, the US in, and Germany down. Well, Germany is ready to come back. Many in Germany, and certainly in the industrial faction, to bring back an industrial orientation. Right now, they've gone back to at least coal plants, and they're building up these natural gas ports on the, it's the level of response to this energy crisis. But there's an opening here where many factions see an opportunity that if this neoliberal agenda of the last 35 plus years, approximately 35 years, is collapsing, there are groupings throughout Europe, especially Germany, Italy, some in France, perhaps in some other nations, Austria with a certain industrial potential. And we certainly see this in the United States. And this is why we cannot allow the idea of a fight for the Republican Party, per se, to be the dominant question. You see the evangelicals already pulling back from Trump. You see this fight for the RNC. Harmeet Dillon is reported as already looking for never Trumpers like Nikki Haley and others to back her for the RNC chair. So is it just shifting chairs? Ronna McDaniel was put in by Trump. She may have some loyalty or commitment. You really can't blame the RNC for the elections. You can hold them accountable on some level, but it's quite an unenviable job of a bunch. It's trying to run some very badly operational corporation. But you see that the question of the fight of the Republican Party is not the question. The question that's at stake is what's required to actually create a nation. Because that's what our responsibility is. That's what this globalist, post-Cold War, globalist neoliberal agenda has threatened, the very existence of nations. And what you don't do, you don't build a nation through massive corruption, circle jerk clowns like Zelensky, touting himself as some new, Castro figure, and attempt to fortify some nationalist, hardcore right-wing militias into a country. It does not function. It does not exist. It's the very corruption of Europe over the course of 1,000 years that these ideas of territory per se creates a nation. It's never been the case. What has created nations, what has created our nation, what has created any nation are a small set, truly, some known, some unknown, but a small set of individuals given the total population over time that have made it a profound sacrifice and devotion to the idea of a mission for a people. regarding a future potential for action of a people to contribute to human society, to human civilization. To make it more concrete, this is what's in the mind of someone like Benjamin Franklin, the leading scientist of the world. He saw the potential for a nation organized around such scientific principles to unleash the greatest industrial manufacturing and scientific capabilities mankind had ever seen. It's why within a short period of time, we went from horse and buggies to landing on the moon. Horse and buggies have been around a long time. But Benjamin Franklin saw that potential. Dante, the great poet and political leader of Florence and of Italy, saw the same potential within the culture of Italy in the 14th century. Joan of Arc saw something similar in France. Many of these people, like Joan of Arc, can come out of obscurity. Abraham Lincoln comes out of a log cabin. He recognized the mission Benjamin Franklin, Washington, and Hamilton had identified. Our nation is built not because of their ability just to secure our nation or our political discourse, even to the point of military conflict, to secure that or to resolve it. Washington did that, Lincoln did that, Grant did that. But they also saw that they could give a mission to the future of the nation, something that unified the people around a shared sacrifice that had been made, or at least the threat of even greater sacrifices. And to resolve that threat and that sacrifice towards something beneficial universally for the children and grandchildren and progeny to come. In many ways, the reason Russia is able to respond today and why they are such a threat to this globalist power is because Putin, among a few others, has resecured through a certain commitment to the nation and its people, a sense of Russia. It's not quite perhaps vibrant as it could be in science and in culture. The Soviet legacy and other things probably, even the looting post-Cold War continue to live on as a legacy. But it is these qualities of leadership and commitment to give a future orientation. And certainly I don't reference the expansion of Russia's land area, but it's the space orientation, the development of Russia's young people, the sense of the fact that Russia has expanded and had the largest grain crop in its history this past harvest, that there is a commitment to grow again Russia's population. So the same is true with any nation of Europe and any nation anywhere, in Africa and South America, in Southeast Asia, in Asia generally, in China or India. And it gives us a sense of why Ukraine is a bankrupt, where the bankruptcy of this globalism and neoliberal exist, because they don't ask any individual to take up any great mission. They ask you to, if you're dumb enough and ambitious and dumb enough, you have to share the combination of both being very ambitious and very dumb, or lacking of brilliance, to become part of a bureaucracy, to become part of a blob that will orchestrate the policies that you're instructed and told to do, which will ultimately just grind down any reason or mission for existence. Like what the green agenda in Europe has been doing. So the challenge for us here, and I'm going to touch on some specifics after these just initial comments, briefly on Ukraine and the situation here, but our task here is to revive this great sense of mission. That's where an army of a small handful of people make a massive change at a point where the system that we've lived in, whether it was the Cold War or whether it was the post kind of neoliberal era, the last 30 plus years, and you have an entire generation who's come of age in that era, that system is now ending. And it can clearly be very destructive, very much to us to our financial system, to our culture and instability, but it can also be a moment of inflection where with real leadership and a real movement and real, you would say an officer core, people responding to it and directing people in the proper direction to fundamentally change the way we move as a civilization. So let me just touch on the Ukraine situation and then come back to the US. The weather is now in freezing conditions throughout Ukraine. And as McGregor and others, as military analysts have made, this is at least a prerequisite for a major land with tank and mobile infantry to move quickly across the farm fields of eastern Ukraine. Now, reports are that there's been Soledar, Bakhmut, and this eastern area have increasingly been targeted by Russian artillery, and then with a certain cleanup by light infantry. But there is the very clear question that Russia is capable of moving on Kiev from the north, from Belarus, large capabilities in the east to eliminate what is likely half of the Ukrainian army defending that Soledar Bakhmut line. That's what's reported. So of a 200,000 reported army personnel in Ukraine, 100,000 are literally in a small area, 50-kilometer line around Soledar and Bakhmut. So it's something where they have heavily invested. The same is true probably near Kherson. But the Russian Navy has mobilized into the Black Sea. There are threats of a possible amphibious assault in Odessa. You have obviously capabilities of moving from the Crimea and that area in the south northward rapidly. What we should all remember, and it's not clear what the Russians are going to do, and if they're even going to go for a quick resolution, they may just want to slowly grind this thing down. There's a lot of considerations that, unless you're inside the Russian general staff, you're not going to be able to make the call. But what we have a sense of is that now the capability for moving out of what's been about a 4-month pause of any major offensive action is likely going to change. And that what was a special military operation deployed with a couple 100,000 troops has now been shifted to something probably approximating 700,000 troops capable of deployment, and a much greater sense that there are going to be no negotiations with Ukraine. In that light, the New York Times put out an article threatening for a long missile capabilities to be given to Ukraine, long-range missile capabilities to target the civilian and military bases in Crimea. So these kinds of threats, in addition to the so-called betrayus policy of the coalition of the willing, largely Poland, maybe Romania, and deploying US military troops into this, but these kinds of threats, and of course there's all kinds of discussion of tanks. The Germans, as of now, in the big discussion about aid to Ukraine at Ramstein Air Force Base, Ramstein Air Base in Germany, said, we're not providing any tanks. They said Poland can do it if they want to. Germany realizes at some level, at least it's indicated by their decision, that we don't want to piss off Russia any more than we have to, which is in Germany's interest. And so you see a shift in that regard. It's not ideological. But the point is, given these kinds of threats that the New York Times is indicating, Russia has has increasing interest towards securing the entire border of Ukraine. So it's not going to be it's very possible that it's not like a split Ukraine, a rump Ukraine, but that it is a fully occupied Ukraine. And then perhaps the Russians will be open for negotiations, and they'll wonder, will now the United States be open for negotiations? This is all incredibly risky, and as I said last week, the biggest danger is, will the loss in Ukraine create conditions for an unstable Biden to launch some type of controlled or limited nuclear type of engagement. That or US troops, but potentially even a limited nuclear type of deployment of artillery, what they call controlled or limited nuclear warheads, to escalate a situation where they've said they can't lose. Now, this gets to perhaps the domestic situation. It is unclear as of now who is targeting Joe Biden. One aspect of this ongoing series of leaks of illegally obtained classified documents, which many members of Congress are now basically attacking Biden, is how did you even get these? When you walk out of a skiff where you look at classified documents, you don't, what do you just stick them accidentally into your coat pocket? So why Biden has these, what they pertain to, the fact that Hunter Biden was involved, clearly the Biden crime family we now know has extensive proof of corrupt operations. I mean, Hunter was on the board of Burisma in Ukraine. Again, another factor of this neoliberal era, much like they've done much of the Wall Street and corporate operations have been in collaboration with China, very corrupt deals. Is this the one effect we see is that Biden's discussion with his family about running for 2024 and for the presidency has been on pause for now. And that's likely at least one, we can say, effect of this so-called classified document leak. His own lawyers have been involved. Is this to weaken Biden? The problem, as anyone who looks at it sees, is that Biden was the only guy they could run that had any chance of probably beating Trump in 2020. Buttigieg is now responsible for the worst airline catastrophe, airline kind of transportation hangups and problems for the last 2 years. So is he really irrelevant? The former mayor of Gary, Indiana, not likely, or South Bend, whatever it was. I think it was. So Kamala, we all know her limitations. You're going to bring in Gavin Newsom. These are all creatures. Gruesome, Newsom, and the rest is not a viable process. So there's increasing panic. Everyone talks about who's going to primary Trump, what's going to happen with DeSantis, and I'll touch on that in a second. But the Democratic Party is bankrupt. You have a top fundraiser that's now Polis, who's now the head of governor of Colorado. They'll probably try to bring in some of these kind of bland technocratic types to maybe fill in for Biden's shoes. The point is there is a crisis in the neoliberal collective over who's going to represent their interest effectively enough and still be able to gain the support of the American people, and a growing crisis where the Ukraine situation exposes the fraud of our foreign policy for 30 years, the bankruptcy of the globalization agenda, the crisis of an economy where all of the major tech firms are now laying off between 5 and 10% of their personnel, from Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and you name it. And this is before, yeah, you could say they're already seeing the contraction, but we haven't even seen what kind of contraction of an economy we really go into this year. Now, oftentimes they talk it up like there's going to be a huge depression to try to kind of lower expectations. So there's a constant psyops operation regarding the economy. But the real question is production, industry, development. They keep investing into green energy. That's a guaranteed economic collapse. There's no way around it, let alone what they've done with mortgage-backed securities, which are already at levels far surpassing, more than 50% greater today than they were in 2008 when the mortgage and housing bubble blew out. But of course, the whole dynamic of the housing system is drastically different. So nothing's like it was, but everything has been reinflated. It is, as been described, an everything bubble. Another reason why is Joe Biden capable of even surviving these next 2 years, and why they might want to weaken his presidency now. But there is panic inside the very centers of neoliberalism because they don't see a way of stopping Donald Trump. If you think DeSantis is a possible option, and many people out there think But Trump has just got such embedded enemies. That enemy class is of no great interest. The majority of people that were told that Trump was the main problem are increasingly recognizing Trump wasn't the reason they might lose their job. The reason they might lose their job is because their job in white collar, tech, financial, real estate sectors was premised on a complete boondoggle of a financial economy run by central banking insanity. That had nothing to do with, Trump actually grew the real economy as best he could and would recommit to that. He stands out as an economic champion as we head into what could be a major economic breakdown. And certainly as we see it with the shortages of energy supply, this is what's happening. DeSantis and the so-called woke, anti-woke warrior DeSantis, the guy that did better with the pandemic than Trump did, which is not true, is really just another Bush League deployment, that his entire staff, his advisors, his whole campaign, the reason he ran for governor, is largely coming directly out of the Jeb Bush, or JEB, or operation in Florida. And this is meant to be the Lincoln Project kind of, operation to support DeSantis as a more likable creature. He's only more likable for the hack political class and people that think about likability from the standpoint of 1990 or 2000. We are in a much more severe situation. And much of the population that grew up in this neoliberal era, the millennial generation, increasingly sees that this economy, this culture, these axioms are not holding together. But what they need to see is not merely attacks on wokeism, CRT, transgenderism. Of course, all of this stuff is totally insane, much like the open border is and the massive drug addiction, which is the drugs are fueling this woke transgender insanity more than anything else. You want to create confusion of sexual identity in adolescents, give them drugs. It happens naturally then. But it is a sense of scientific mission. This is why LaRouche PAC launched Project Prometheus soon after the midterm elections. We just had a major breakthrough. There's going to be funding now for a propulsion rocket. It's a kind of a dual nuclear system, both thermo and electric nuclear propulsion rocket. They'll be under development at the University of Florida, probably amongst other corporations, that now has the capacity to reduce the flight between the Earth and Mars from 6 months, which is really untenable, to 45 days. And as Keisha Rogers said earlier today, really the question, reducing that from 45 days even down to a few weeks is certainly possible. That's about 6 weeks, 6.5 weeks. We could even make that less than half, but that's a viable ability for the United States and human civilization to really participate in that extraterrestrial exploration of our universe, that we are a solar system-wide species. There are no limits to growth. There are no limits to energy. And increasingly, as we saw with the breakthrough at Lawrence Livermore, there is a growth of optimism regarding the nuclear fusion capacity. As one scientist at MIT said recently in a podcast, people always said it was 40 years away, 40 years away. It's now 4 years away. And it's that kind of commitment and a sense of urgency where with real leadership, at a moment of where there is a collapse of current axioms, there's a collapse of the ideology which tries to make the world coherent. That what LaRouche always recognizes, the way you create real coherence, not the fake coherence of neoliberalism or the Cold War, the constant enemy image, as they tried with the constant threat of terrorism or climate change. The real coherence is to drive a scientific vector of growth and development, to unleash a kind of optimism, and then to foster and develop that optimism around the greatest works of art, around a canon of great of great novels, poetry, history, and music to build up that sense of identity rapidly, which can be done in a matter of 5 and 10 years. At the same time, we're building that permanent colony on the moon as a station to go to Mars. So we come back to many of the same topics. But what stands out based on when you look at this current situation, both the nagging attempts to try to bring down Trump or act like maybe he's not the guy, like the evangelicals who won't endorse him this time. Look, and Trump said it, the pro-life movement, where were they? We ran a major pro-life governor candidate in Michigan. They didn't bring any money. They didn't bring any enthusiasm. They just sat back and did nothing. To a large, as a national major political arm, nothing. Where was the fight? But that's not surprising, right? The evangelical churches have not been built up as the center of patriotic mobilization. And what Trump has recognized is that the real driver is the economic perspective. That's where you create real morality. So despite whatever they try to pull in South Carolina, he's going to have a major summit there. He's pulling together his campaign. And our sense should be to build out that campaign wherever we are around these kinds of profound ideas. This is a war against a failed ideology of neoliberalism, which at the center of is this kind of a central banking scheme of economic insanity. We're going to replace it at the core with a real viable economic sense of mission and growth. And in doing so, even if it's a small handful of us, is how you actually build a real nation. You create a new nation with a new mission, which is really the nature of what our founding principles are, that it's to make it more perfect, which is not a gradual question, but sometimes it comes in lunges, right? Big leaps. So we'll see what happens in Ukraine. There's no way you can forecast what will happen there. But what we saw confirmed in Davos, everybody realizes this is big. The bigger question is not to sit and watch it. You know, we don't want to sit and watch paint dry. That's for the crack addicts and drug addicts. The question we want to do is, how do we engage and mobilize this growing potential movement in the United States, which is going to include far more universal swath of the population. People under 35 and under 40 are increasingly realizing, you know, living alone, in working in tech, renting a bed for $3,000 a month like they do in San Francisco is really an insane way of living. And that now they're going to get laid off and nobody else is hiring. What was this all about? So the crisis isn't just in the working class, it's even in the white collar kind of techie type world, which has been premised on the idea that somehow social media or stupid gigs like, you know, taxi cabs and getting your food delivered to your house is like some great advancement in human society. Well, as this thing collapses, there's going to be a real potential to mobilize people. And many of these young people, the reason they even got into computers and science was because of things like the space program. And we capture their imagination, but we don't do it from the standpoint of fantasy-based, how interesting it would be about the reindustrialization. And so we're going to have more on this, more on the ability to mobilize the US industry, much of which remains in the defense sector. We've got some work coming on that, but I want to leave my comments there and see what you guys think and what questions or thoughts you have to contribute. So Keisha, I'll throw it back to you.